Okay, good morning, everyone. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. Juice, are you ready?
I think so.
Okay. So before we begin our lecture for today, I just want to inform everyone who might not be familiar with our organization. So the series of webinars that we've been having every Friday morning here in the Philippines and 8 p.m. in, sorry, hold on. I think I'm getting feedback. All right. So the organization is the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering. So this is an organization made up of scientists and engineers of Philippine descent. Initially, it was organized by those from the Philippines and in the US, but now we've expanded and we have members coming from other countries right now. So this is the fifth webinar that we're having. For today, we will be tackling reflections on the impact of flatten the curve on interdependent workforce sectors. Our speaker is currently an associate professor in the Department of Engineering, Management and Systems Engineering at the George Washington University. His research interests lie at the intersection of systems engineering, disaster risk, disaster risk analysis, and economics. He is one of the principal investigators in the 2018 Mitigation Saves version 2.0 report that has been cited by many journals, news media, and research agencies across the world. He is also one of the principal investigators in an ongoing multi university National Science Foundation grant, CRISP 2.0 Type 2 collaborative research organizing decentralized resilience in critical interdependent infrastructure systems and processes. He has received two Best Paper Awards from the Society of Risk Analysis as well as the Leontiev Memorial Prize from the International Input Output Association. So without further ado, let us all welcome our speaker, Professor Just Santos. Okay, Just, you may begin.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me, Kay?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you for the nice introduction. So, today I'll be presenting a webinar whose title is Reflections on the Impact of Flatten the Curve on Interdependent Workforce Sectors. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the PAASE, Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering, for giving me the opportunity to participate in the 40th anniversary, I believe, and also the National Science Foundation, which funds most of my work pertaining to disaster risk management, and of course, my university, George Washington University. So, I'm going to stop my video, but I'll turn it on again during the Q&A portion so that I can concentrate on the slides. So the agenda for the presentation will be as follows. So I'll be telling a little bit about the origin of the flatten the curve, which originated in CDC year 2007, and it's been highly used. So the likelihood that you will hear the phrase flatten the curve when you turn on your television and tune into your favorite news channel is highly likely. I'll be talking about suppression and mitigation measures, economic input-output model and extensions, some of the data sources, hypothetical case study using real-world data, and an opportunity to have a dialogue with you to discuss any questions that you may have. So the flatten the curve concept has gained significant attention in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. The aim of the flatten the curve is to decrease the peak, not only to decrease the peak, but also to delay it. So it's some sort of a strategy to buy time in order for the healthcare capacity to be maintained, and at the same time buying time until hopefully the next vaccine will become available for the virus. So world leaders have implemented various non-pharmaceutical interventions recently. Some categories include containment, suppression, and mitigation. So the overarching question that I'd like to articulate in this presentation is, to what extent do non-pharmaceutical interventions affect workforce sectors across different interdependent sectors? So evolution of the flatten the curve. So this is the original graphic, if you're curious, showing the flatten the curve graphic that was published in the CDC report to the left of the slide, which is entitled Interim Pre-Pandemic Planning Guidance, Community Strategy for Pandemic Influenza Mitigation. So this was in year 2007. And since then, recently, year 2020, this was published by The Economist. The authors are London and Milan. So you might think it's just a trivial visualization or extension of the previous graphic, but the intention here is to use different colors for the two curves that are easy on the eyes of people with some color blindness or some visual impairment. Interestingly, I could have thought about it, or Kay could have thought about it. So this important horizontal line that you're seeing here made Dr. Drew Harris popular. So just by the simple addition of the horizontal line, which emphasizes the importance of healthcare system capacity. So the blue epidemic curve shows that the peak has been delayed and also flattened in order to not strain the healthcare system capacity. Animation has also been created to illustrate ways with which the curve can be flattened. And if you can see the animation, I'm gonna play it. So the blue curve, it transitions from the blue to the yellow. And the blue curve is the no intervention case, and the yellow curve comprises of measures such as washing of hands, personal protective equipment, and social distancing. So suppression and mitigation measures. So I have a confession to tell you that I tend to use suppression and mitigation interchangeably, but recently I've gained better understanding on the clear-cut distinction between the two. So, but before we proceed with the definitions, it seems like I'm preaching to the choir right now when I say that pandemic refers to a widespread outbreak of a disease, often infecting large populations across the globe. So everyone knows this. Pandemics have disrupted modern civilization. So the most popular one in case of case studies is the Spanish flu that happened in 1918. And the 1918 Spanish flu marked one of the deadliest viral pandemics in modern times, eradicating roughly 1/3 of the world's population. Imagine that. So 50 million mortalities worldwide. And in the United States alone, 500 million. But some people speculate that it could be as much as 750,000, including the unreported cases. So these numbers are really can blow your minds away. So to date, the world has borne witness to the devastating and unprecedented impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we call the pandemic as COVID-19, and the underlying virus responsible for that pandemic is the so-called SARS-CoV-2, which is a severe acute respiratory syndrome, similar to the one that happened in 2003. I still remember that vividly because that's the time that I was defending my dissertation at the University of Virginia. Effective pharmaceutical interventions, examples of which are vaccines and antivirals. I was watching the news earlier, and there seems to be positive news about the drug remdesivir that, according to Dr. Fauci, has reduced the recovery time from 15 days to 11 days. So a four-day difference, which from the perspective of recovery and also healthcare system operations would be so significant. So let's just hope and pray that this good news will still continue to roll in. And also, Dr. Fauci said that the vaccine could be available as early as January 2020. I really hope so because I'm really craving to come back to my homeland, which is the Philippines. So in order to mitigate or suppress the pandemic, in the absence of pharmaceutical interventions which are not available for novel coronavirus or viruses such as the COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2, we need to implement some non-pharmaceutical interventions, including testing, isolation, hand hygiene, PPE, social distancing, travel restrictions, and closures of schools and businesses. So Sweden is one of the countries that have chosen to be lenient with non-pharmaceutical interventions. And right now, it's so saddening to hear in the news of the escalating increase in the infection rates in the country of Sweden. So recent articles have created three categories of non-pharmaceutical interventions, including containment, suppression, and mitigation. So in this presentation, I will make an attempt to just simplify it. I'm gonna cluster containment with suppression, although they are fundamentally different also. So what is containment? Containment is the approach of managing individual infection chains. This can be achieved by broad testing, contact tracing, isolation. So this is what's called case isolation, specifically of people with that have contracted the disease, and isolation of travelers coming from high prevalence areas, and of course, border closures and travel restrictions. Containment is only effective when applied prior to the occurrence of the so-called community spread or community transmission. It's also effective when suppression has been already effectively implemented. Just like in the case of New Zealand. New Zealand has reported no new infection cases for coronavirus. And shout out to the female Prime Minister of New Zealand, whose name is Jacinda Ardern. So moving on, suppression aims to decrease the basic reproduction number to a value lower than 1. So the reproduction number, which is called R0, is a measure of the transmissibility or how contagious the virus or the disease is. So suppression, the aim is to lower it to a value which is lower than 1. And suppression includes quarantine. So in the Philippines, you have the ECQ. Everyone already knows ECQ by heart by now, the acronym. And in addition, implementing some of the containment measures like broad testing and travel restrictions. So suppression is not a panacea. It doesn't solve everything. We still need the vaccine. As a matter of fact, suppression, there's also a risk of encountering a resurgence of the virus, perhaps a deadlier second wave or a deadlier subsequent wave. So that's why there's also this strategy called mitigation. This is actually the one that is highly associated with the flatten the curve concept or phrase. It does not aim to completely stop the transmission. It does not aim to lower the R0 to a value lower than 1. Its objective is to sufficiently just catch up with the capacity of the healthcare capacity. And mitigation measures include social distancing, PPEs, hand hygiene. And advantages, less restriction on contact, so less impact on our personal liberties. And also hope and pray that there will be herd immunity after the first wave. And we assume that there will be low or negligible rate of reinfection. So what is input-output model, which is the engine driving the hypothetical simulation that I'll be presenting later on in this presentation. So I made a promise to Kay to keep it to under 40 minutes. I'm gonna try my best to do better than that. So input-output model has been developed by Wassily Leontief. So he published an article, a seminal article in the Journal of Review of Economics and Statistics in 1936. Eventually, he has won the Nobel Prize for this model. So the primary reference for input-output analysis is Miller and Blair. Second edition was published in year 2009. So let's take the hypothetical case of a two-sector economy, which is the pedagogical example, the same example that was used in the book by Miller and Blair. So let's assume we have two sectors, and the total output for industry sector 1 is 1,000. We can decompose that into final demand and intermediate consumptions within sectors 1 and 2, which would be 150 and 500. So the sum of which, when added to the final demand, will be the total output. The same can be done with in the sector 2 if you read horizontally on that particular row. Final demand is the so-called gross domestic product. You can also read it vertically. So if you add 150 with 200, the sum will be the total input, which is 1,000, and the missing link here is the value added. So the reason why I'm emphasizing value added here is because value added is the one that contains the workforce contribution to the input of the production for the sectors. So some of you who have been doing economics might have heard of the acronym KLEMS, which stands for capital, labor, energy, materials, and services. And we will be focusing on L, which is labor. So just basic matrix manipulation here. We can, at the bottom of the slide, you can see A, which is the Leontief matrix, the technical coefficient matrix. And it can be computed using the raw data by dividing each cell in the shaded portion of the matrix by the respective or by the corresponding column sum. And in doing that, for example, the 0.15 came from dividing 150 by 1,000. And at the bottom of that 2 by 2 matrix, if you can see the number 0.05, it was calculated by dividing 100 by 2,000. So we can see some sort of a mass balance here. So the total production, which is to the left of the matrix here, matrix operation or the vector operation here, can be decomposed as intermediate demand and also the final demand. And we can also calculate the so-called L, which is the inverse of the I minus A. So if you look at the top of this slide, you can see X equals AX plus C. If we'd like to isolate X, we can do that by taking I minus A inverse and multiplying it with C, which is the final demand. And I minus A inverse is a very useful set of data sets published by statistical agencies across the world. And I'll explain that on the next slide. So for this slide, you can compute the I minus A inverse by taking the inverse of that matrix at the bottom of the slide. But instead of referring to this 2 by 2 hypothetical example, might as well look at a real world data. So I'm going to use the 15-sector aggregation scheme of the United States input-output table. This is the I minus A inverse, which is denoted by the capital L. And why am I saying that this is important? So it's very important and it's also easy to interpret. If you look at the column sums of L, you will find that the highest one is manufacturing. That's the column S5. If you can see the number 2.4843, it means that for every $1 or 1 peso increase in demand for manufacturing, S5 is manufacturing, the total bang for the buck, if I may, is 2.48. Okay, so for every $1 increase in demand, that's a huge multiplier. It's a factor of 2.5. And we're only talking $1. So just imagine multiplying that by billions of dollars, which is the order of magnitude of the manufacturing sector in the United States. Another example will be the first column, which is S1, which is agriculture. It's also one of the sectors that give the best bang for the buck. For every $1 increase in demand, the total gross profit or revenue to that sector will be 2.25. And you can do the same for all of the remaining columns of this table here. And then we can also discuss inoperability here. So for those of you who were here last Friday, Krista, Dr. Yu set the stage for discussing the inoperability. Inoperability is a simple concept. So remember that we have the X, which measures the output of a sector. So we have the ideal output, but what if that output degrades to a lower level because of a disaster? So if we normalize the difference, Xi minus Xi tilde, which is the degraded production output, and divide it by the ideal level, we will be able to calculate the so-called inoperability. So just to illustrate that simple concept, suppose that the ideal production output of a sector is 100 for whatever unit it is. So let's just say 100. So let's say a disaster strikes and that sector is only able to deliver 90 units. So the inoperability will be 10% because 10 over 100 will be the percentage of the product that is not delivered by that particular sector. So equation-wise, the formulation for the inoperability input-output model is structurally similar to the classical Leontief input-output model, which you can see at the bottom of the slide. And you can also have a dynamic version of this. And one point of emphasis here is that the time-varying nature of inoperability. So later on, I will be discussing the so-called epi curve. So what's unique with the epi curve? It's actually the curve for the flatten the curve concept that we have started with this presentation. So you see that the level of infection rate as day 1 or day 2 progresses, it could increase and it could plateau when it reaches the peak, and then it would start to decline again. So that is the time-varying behavior of inoperability. So later on, I will be able to connect directly the so-called the concept of attack rate or infection rate with the concept of inoperability. Another point that I'd like to emphasize here is the concept of resilience. So resilience is the ability of the sector, the speed, and also its coping mechanism to come back to its pre-disaster state. So this is an example that was published by my colleague and I, Cash Barker. For illustration purposes, let's consider the two sectors here. So the light blue sector is sector 2 and the dark blue sector is sector 1. So the directly affected sector is sector 2. Initially, sector 1 is unaffected. Its initial inoperability is 0. But as time progresses, you will see that sector 1's inoperability is non-zero anymore. And there will come a time where the inoperability of sector 1 might even exceed that of sector 2. A real-world example will be that of the flooding in Thailand that caused the supply chain for the semiconductors, the chips that are used for the production of computers, to degrade. So it has cascading effect that eventually impacted the ability of companies that produce, let's say, hard drives. So one of my friends work at one of the companies that are the leading producers of hard disks. And personally, I like personal accounts from actual people who have firsthand experience. And she told me that their production was severely affected by the loss of raw materials or intermediate materials coming from Thailand. The same can be said from the earthquake that happened in Japan that lost the ability to produce automotives. So therefore, decreasing the ability of Japanese car manufacturers to deliver their usual as-planned production. So here's just a schematic of the interdependency matrix. And as you can see, the sectors are interacting with each other. And we can use data sets that are published by the Bureau of Economic Analysis or also IMPLAN, which I have a screenshot of later on. For the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken, I still remember off the top of my head, National Statistical Coordination Board, which is the one that publishes the input-output data sets for the Philippines. So the data sources, this is a screenshot of an actual case study that I'm working on for Portland Airport. And I'm working with this project with Professor Adam Rose. And it's really a small world in the disaster risk management community, of which Dr. Yasuhide Okuyama is also a significant player. So this is just a screen capture of Implan, telling you the possible outputs here, the direct, indirect losses, and also the top sectors that are affected when the airport sector is affected. This is the website of Bureau of Economic Analysis showing different types of input-output accounts data. So you have the 15 industries, which I've shown to you previously. There's also the 71 industry classification and the larger one, which is the so-called benchmark tables, comprising of 405 industries, which only get published on a 5-year cycle. So from the epidemiology side, we have the R0, which is well documented, and laboratory-based surveillance data published on a weekly basis by the CDC. So I published series of articles on the H1N1 that happened in 2009. So some of you may have heard of the acronym ILI, which stands for influenza-like illness. Syndromic surveillance is a different kind of surveillance that relies on statistical data. And I'll be referring to epidemic curve or EpiCurve, which can be constructed from data that are issued by CDC and also by Johns Hopkins University, specifically for the COVID-19. So some of you may have seen this wonderful dashboard that is available from the Johns Hopkins website. So it's a nicely designed dashboard. So US is at the top, obviously, and the count for mortalities is so fast. This is just from this morning. So when I was capturing this, the data has already changed. So I don't know, as I'm speaking right now, how many mortalities are there. My estimate is it's already higher than 61,000 mortalities just on for the United States only. This is the so-called laboratory-based surveillance data that are published by CDC. This is really fresh from the oven, if I may. So this is for the COVID-19. So showing the number of incidences broken into different age brackets. And I'm happy to say that I'm part of the 18 to 49 age bracket. So it makes me feel smile in this especially hard times. So case study and results. So recent articles have underscored the efficacy of implementing suppression and mitigation measures. And I'd like to acknowledge Raymond Tan, I don't know if he's here, for pointing me to the Ferguson article, I believe published by the Imperial College, that have emphasized the urgency of implementing mitigation and suppression measures. And also a wonderful article published by Tomas Pueyo, Hammer and the Dance, which one of my favorite people in the world translated in Filipino, Dr. Michael Promentilla, which actually I'm going off tangent here. Reminds me that we share the same birthday. I'm not gonna tell when, but it's quite soon. So the daily number of new infections can be expressed in terms of percentage relative to the population, widely documented, assuming that the data is being truthful. I don't want to go into the misrepresentation of data accusations for one country that I think you know what I'm thinking about or talking about here. So this percentage is called the attack rate. More sophisticated term for that is the so-called incidence proportion. If you click on the link here, you will find data for the attack rates. So with no further ado, the production factor, we can decompose it according to different contributors to the factors of production. And one of the most significant one is labor in the KLEMS paradigm, which I will just be calling workforce here. If we take the ratio of the workforce contribution to the total output, similar to the 2 by 2 table that I've shown to you earlier, then we can tell the extent to which each sector or any sector for that matter is dependent on labor. So some sectors are less labor intensive than others. So for example, automation in sectors such as advanced manufacturing has dramatically reduced the dependence of this sector on workforce. Traditionally, these are really labor intensive sectors. In addition, I also would like to pinpoint the possibility of workforce continuity strategies such as teleworking. And I'm able to practice that right now. So as a professor at George Washington University, I'm able to fully, and I should say successfully, transition my classroom teaching into virtual format. So in other words, if we're able to perform or implement mitigation and suppression, the assumption is that healthy workers in quarantine can be assumed to work remotely, hence reducing the impact on business closures. So these are the 4 scenarios that I considered. So these are hypothetical simulations, but the underlying data are realistic. When designing the epicurves here, I looked at several articles published by New Zealand Imperial College and also the Tomas Pueyo Hammer and Dance article that I alluded to earlier. So scenario 1 baseline, the epicurve, the start day is 0, peak 30 days, and meaning to say no more infections, 60, day 60, and the peak attack rate is 50%. The same interpretation for columns 2, 3, and 4. For example, for scenario 2, the peak has been delayed to occur at day equals 40 and the end is 90 days. It's longer, but the peak attack rate has been halved from 50% to 25%. For scenario 3, it's longer but flatter. So peak is 50, end is 120 days. And the peak attack rate is 10% relative to the 50% for the baseline case. I considered scenario 4, which is suppression plus continuity, identical parameters, but I tweaked the labor dependence ratios because some sectors like universities and some sectors like those that can offer their services in a virtual format can reduce their dependence on the workforce and further suppress the economic losses from further proliferating. So the bottom of the bullet here is also one of the things that I'd like to revisit when I go to the conclusions part. So these are the 4 results for the scenarios. So it's hard to read on your screen, but I'd like to summarize to you that the top 10 sectors for scenarios 1 to 3 are the same, simply for the reason that input-output model is a linear model. But you can see the flattening of the curve across the 4 scenarios. So the top 10 sectors for scenarios 1 to 3 include state and general government, miscellaneous professional, scientific, and technical services, ambulatory healthcare services, which is not a surprise at all, wholesale trade, construction, which is also labor intensive, among others. And if you look closely to the economic losses for the 4th one, which is the suppression plus continuity, the rankings of the sectors have been changed. It's because we are able to tweak or modify the dependency of the sectors on labor. So we can see that construction becomes number 2 here instead of the previous ranking, which is about 5. So I'll be doing some summaries for some interesting key findings here on this slide. So one of the intuitive conclusions is that the magnitude of the losses depend on the size of the sector, as well as the labor dependence of the sectors. So interestingly, state and local government, wholesale trade, and construction are among the highest contributors to the GDP, and it comes without a surprise that these sectors had been picked up by the simulation as one of the top 10 critical sectors. Another interesting observation, the third bullet here, prevalence of labor-dependent sectors can also be observed in the rankings, albeit their moderate contribution to the GDP, examples of which are admin and support services, hospitals, management of companies and enterprises, and it really breaks my heart for the restaurants that are surrounding my condo building here, that they're not operating with 100% functionality before the pandemic disaster. So the changes in the rankings from scenarios 1, 2, 3 to 4, there are also interesting observations. So it can be attributed to the capability of the sectors, the so-called improvisation, to have workforce continuity plans, hence enabling them to further reduce their projected losses. For example, the impact on state and local government has improved. Ranking has changed from 1 to 5. So I live in the National Capital Region, Washington, D.C., and all I could tell you, and my sister works for the government, and all I could tell you that they could work from home, minimal disruption to the delivery of their tasks and responsibilities. In contrast, the impact on wholesale trade has worsened. The ranking has changed from 7 to 2. It's because there's not a lot we can do with the wholesale trade in order to continue their operations and to reduce their dependence on the workforce. Finally, new sectors emerge in the new rankings such as other retail, which is a cousin of the wholesale trade sector, as well as administrative and support services. So to summarize the results, the aggregate economic loss results for the 4 scenarios, the red curve is for the baseline scenario, the blue curve is for the mitigation scenario, the green curve is for the suppression, and the yellow curve is for the suppression, and added to that is continuity of operations. So we really can see the flattening of the curve, not only the delaying the arrival of the peak, hence helping the healthcare system to maintain its capacity. And another interesting observation here is that it also has the potential to curb the economic losses, curb as in CURB. So summary of results for the hypothetical simulations, $1.3 trillion for the baseline scenario. So that's a huge percentage of the GDP of the United States, which is approximately equal to $21 trillion. Scenario 2, mitigation, which is $714 billion. Suppression, $380.7 billion. And scenario 4, finally, $186.9 billion. So you can see the proportions with respect to the GDP. Scenario 4 happens to be the lowest, which is 1% of the GDP. These are annualized GDP. If you're looking at the reports, you might be thinking, why are my numbers small than the usual numbers you would see, which is to the tune of, let's say, 20% or 10%, upwards of 10%. It's because they're basing it on the second quarter GDP. So moving on, discussion. And I think I'm gonna be able to keep my promise to Kay to maintain the webinar in under 40 minutes. So hypothetical simulations suggest that mitigation and suppression measures can flatten the curve and reduce also the economic losses. So the results are counterintuitive. This perspective article will be published. It's just been accepted for publication. But one of the major concerns of the reviewer is that the result is counterintuitive. Suppression and mitigation also drastically degrade the operability of economic sectors due to enforced business and school closures. So some are even talking about unprecedented unemployment rates upwards of 20%, close to the depression era. So however, the baseline scenario, which assumes significantly fewer closures, may lead to steeper and faster incidences of absenteeism. So more workers will be getting sick, or they will be cohabiting with people who might need care, And the worst case scenario is people might die. And we're seeing it right now. There's really a clear and present danger with balancing the mitigation and suppression across, versus uh, lenient restrictions, just like what I mentioned earlier for the country of Sweden. So this is also a study recently published by Korea, I believe from Harvard School, concluded that US cities that implemented more aggressive and prolonged social distancing measures emerged with higher employment growth years after the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. So the blue dots correspond to cities that implement strict social distancing among other mitigation measures, and the red dots are those that implemented more lenient policies. So not only that their growth rates are higher in general, but the mortalities along the y-axis, you could see that the blue curves tend to be on the left side, which means that the mortalities are lower. So nonetheless, an important caveat has to be made with the COVID-19. I looked at the clock and I think I lied to Kay. I'm sorry about that. I'm just a few slides away from the end point. Steep escalation of unemployment rates, which I already mentioned, and there will come a point in time that prolonged suppression and mitigation measures may result in global economic collapse. So we really need the government to assist people who are unemployed and implement creative approaches and put them in place to cushion the losses, especially to vulnerable sectors. So examples include curbside pickup or delivery for stores and restaurants. So I have an online app, Instacart. I can do my shopping online and it can get delivered right in front of my doorstep. And that particular company needs hundreds of thousands of new workers to deliver household items to wherever they are needed. We can also consider leveraging IT and virtual services to continue sector production, which I personally am doing. So for the curbside pickup, I try to help the local restaurants around me by picking up food, which I'm gonna do after this webinar to have dinner to support the local restaurants around my condominium building. So why are governments cautious and generally averse with implementation of such non-pharmaceutical interventions? The main intervention is the impingement on personal liberty. And many studies have pointed to adverse effects of isolation, including mental health. It increases risk of anxiety, depression, and substance use. So this is my best friend. His name is Munir Alaframi. He also happens to be my student before. We just became best friends. He worked in NASA. He was in a super tight, confined environment for 45 days. And I would just like to summarize what he shared with me, firsthand account of his experience. So as the days and weeks went by, I noticed my progress with various tasks and experiments, which undoubtedly fueled me with energy and focus to keep going. So such activities like strictly following schedule and keeping himself active helped him deal with the anxieties associated with isolation. So I also would like to point out that the impact of COVID-19 is disproportionate. So in other words, lower income groups has been found to be much more profound. So the impacts, it impeded their ability to access basic resources, employment, as well as access to services like healthcare and online education. And also studies have indicated that low-income groups are also the ones who are susceptible or vulnerable to contracting the disease, which further compounds the social or socioeconomic disparities. So in sum, I presented several simulations for non-pharmaceutical interventions. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'd like to just go quickly to the last bullet here. Current disaster management needs to be thoroughly reviewed and reevaluated and to be enhanced to minimize the impact of future pandemics and future disasters. So let me make my last slide to be the graphic that I stole from CDC, the 1918 flu pandemic, which comprised of three epidemic curves. So I'm just gonna read it straight from the website. It says here, the pandemic peaked in the US during the second wave in the fall of 1918. This highly fatal second wave was responsible for most of the US deaths attributed to the pandemic. So when I say that, I have this convoluted feeling of both fear and hope, that fear of a second deadlier second wave, and also the hope that drugs like remdesivir and a vaccine as early as January 2020 will become available. And with that, I went over time by 5 minutes. So this will be the closure for my presentation. And I'll be happy to turn the floor to Dr. Aviso. If there are questions, she will be happy to answer your questions.
Ha ha ha. Thank you very much, Juice. I think that was a very informative talk, and you've really clarified different aspects of this pandemic that we are going through right now. It just occurred to me that in the Philippines, it's Labor Day, and it's very timely that you're talking about labor force for this particular talk. And it's a good thing that I didn't schedule you during your birthday. Okay. Sige. Before we go on to the questions, maybe just to refresh our listeners, can you again try to reiterate what's the difference between mitigation and suppression?
Suppression is to drive down the R naught or the basic reproduction number to a value lower than 1. And mitigation is to flatten the curve, not necessarily bringing the R naught to a value less than 1,
Okay.
but delaying the arrival of the peak and also lowering it so as not to strain the capacity of healthcare system. And it also has the advantage of enhancing the so-called herd immunity.
I see. So, with regards to the different strategies that the governments are putting into place, which of those strategies actually fall into suppression and which ones fall into mitigation?
So all I could tell you in the Philippines, if effectively implemented, assuming that it's effectively implemented, I don't want to talk about politics, but
Yeah, yeah.
ECQ, strictly speaking, it falls under the category of suppression.
I see.
Social distancing is mitigation. So there's a gray area, but I'm sure,
Okay.
assuming that it's effectively implemented, what's going on in Metro Manila falls under the category of suppression.
Okay, thank you very much just for that clarification. Okay, we have one question from Professor Okuyama. So, are the positive impacts of new hires for delivery included in your simulations?
I actually was scared that someone would ask that question. I didn't consider that because it's just a tiny part of a bigger sector.
Um,
Instacart, for example, Instacart and companies that deliver food like Beyond Menu, GrabHub, Amazon, Whole Foods also do that stuff. So I didn't. The short answer to the question is I didn't consider that in the analysis. I only considered the negative impacts.
Okay. I'm not sure if it's the same there in the US, but I think in the Philippines, I observed that there has been an increase of, I don't know, companies who allow for this kind of service to occur. Um, how do you think this will influence the results of your simulation?
So it will influence it in a sense that there's a possibility that economic losses might still further go down to take into account the positive gains that are experienced by sectors like online restaurants and online delivery and online retail. I've heard of Lazada in the Philippines. I don't know if the business has increased in the
Um,
aftermath or like right now, in not even aftermath.
I don't know also. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And we have a question from Denny from Heriot Watt University in Malaysia. So, based on the proposed model, it is assumed that there is a linear relationship among industries. How do you capture the actual situation as a new normal stage may be achieved post pandemic?
So that's a very good question. So that's why we need more sophisticated models like computable general equilibrium that takes into account substitutions and price elasticity. So the input-output model can give realistic results for fast onset disasters. But if we're talking about a disaster that would span 2 years, just like the
Okay.
forecast for COVID-19, then we need models like computable general equilibrium. And
So, do you
Dr. Yu is an expert in CGE.
Yes, I'm not sure if Dr. Yu is listening to us right now, but one of the requests of one of our participants, if it's possible to actually conduct similar simulations for the Philippine data. So I hope Dr. Yu is listening.
I'm
Okay.
sure it's possible, and I'd like to collaborate with you to do a similar analysis. We only have to consider the high level of granularity for the sectors that are published by NSCB, because I think it's only a dozen, if I'm not mistaken. But Krista knows the better answer to that question.
Yes. Too bad that she's not with us on Zoom, but maybe she's with us on YouTube. Okay. Okay, we have a question from Fred Tapia. So, how does the time length of implementing and maintaining these measures affect the result of the simulation?
So the results of the simulation, very good question. It's an extraordinary question coming from Dr. Tapia. Is that correct, Dr.
Yes, it
Tapia?
is. It is Dr. Tapia.
Okay, so it's highly sensitive because the table that I've shown you in one of the slides, I assume the length of the recovery, 90 days, 120 days. So if we change the assumption, then the economic losses would also change. So those durations, I kind of borrowed some of the graphics that were published by Thomas Pueyo and also from New Zealand.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions from Chris. Do you know if very similar, these kinds of analysis are happening also in the Philippines?
I think I haven't heard of like a detailed analysis, just like the analysis that was conducted in New Zealand and
Mhm.
also in Imperial College. But I just take my answer with a grain of salt. But I constantly look to the extent possible to the studies that are published on this topic. And so far, I haven't come across analysis of the trade-offs between implementation of suppression slash mitigation
Mhm.
versus economic loss, workforce disruption, and also personal liberty.
Okay, we have a second question also from Chris. If the data on infections are inaccurate, how bad can the impact be on the analysis, and therefore affect the NPI actions?
The reason why I'm smiling right now, one of my favorite quotations in the whole world. I cannot see people on the screen, so I don't know how animated I am. I turned on my video. So the reason why I'm smiling, one of my favorite quotes, and I'm sure some of you have heard of it, from the famous statistician George Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And also borrowing the lingo from, not lingo, the favorite software optimization software of Dr. Abiso,
Yes.
just the word lingo. Borrowing the lingo from computer science or computer engineering, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out.
Yes, yes.
So I don't know how accurate the reporting is in the Philippines, but some countries have been accused of underreporting their cases. And I think you know what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, but on a related note, Just, do you think it's possible to integrate that uncertainty into the model so that the results can at least provide you with maybe a range of what to expect?
Yeah, beautiful question. Who asked that?
Me,
Are you?
I asked it.
I was gonna joke that whoever asked that question should be given a PhD degree. Unfortunately, you already have a PhD degree.
Maybe I
So
can do a
yeah,
double.
yeah. When I defended my dissertation, one of the questions was, did you perform like a confidence interval analysis for your results? And when I was doing my dissertation, I did like a CI analysis or confidence interval analysis for this study because the results are preliminary and I don't want the epi curves that I've shown to you. I'd like it to be as simple as possible. If I perform sensitivity analysis for the peak rate and also the duration, the graphs will be ugly, or you will see lots
I
of
see.
lots of complications there, complexities. But I do agree that uncertainty analysis is important. As a matter of fact, there's also one of my favorite quotes from Adam Rose that fixed point analysis, which I've done,
Hmm.
is almost always assuredly incorrect. And it's also an expression of arrogance, according to him. I'm paraphrasing.
Okay, we have viewers on YouTube, and one of them is Raymond Tan, and he has a question for you. In typical IO data, is there a way to differentiate white collar and blue collar workers? Presumably, that the former type of work is more amenable to work from home arrangements.
Um, it may need additional data collection. So for example, some of the social accounting matrices, which are extensions of the input-output model, are
Mhm.
collected by companies like Implan. Implan is a popular tool here in the United States, but it's super expensive. So for example, one of the cases that I'm working with right now for Portland, we had to pay $10,000 for the data set. So when I open the data set, it's quite impressive because the social accounting matrices decompose the data according to age groups to different socioeconomic brackets, among many other decompositions. So as a matter of fact, Adam Rose is the one doing the decomposition of the losses according to different socioeconomic groups. So I kind of sidetracked Raymond's question, but it's in the same vein that some of the labor proportions can be decomposed rather. I was gonna say disintegrated, but it sounded bad. So decomposed according to different types of labor, whether it's blue collar or white collar, or whether it's part-time versus full-time, the so-called FTE or full-time equivalent.
So, just I'm curious, who collects that type of data for the US? Is it spearheaded by a private organization, or is it done by by the government?
It's done by a private company. But the
Okay.
$10,000 that I mentioned, we were actually able to reduce it to $6,000 because of government discount. So I'm doing this project for the federal government. So
And
it's
they
a
do
private
this.
agency. Yeah.
Okay, and they do this data collection on a regular basis, or does somebody have to request them to conduct the survey?
It's they're doing it. They're doing everything, and the data are quite transparent, and they publish the data on an annual basis. So let's say if I'm gonna make an analysis right now, so the results are only applicable to this year. If I'm going to repeat the analysis, then I will have to pay additional $6,000
Hmm.
because the data would have changed. So they're
Okay,
doing all
wow.
the data collections, and it's a
Okay,
private company.
okay, thank you. We have another question from Matthew Mercado. Why is it considered that suppression and mitigation are counterintuitive when most businesses and schools can operate fine online?
Matthew Mercado happens to be a student of mine from George
Oh, yeah.
Washington University. I'm surprised that you're here. Thank you. So, one of the scenarios that I considered, which is scenario four, suppression plus continuity. So, I have a big list of sectors, and I actually applied some proportions, reduction factors for sectors that are able to cope with the pandemic scenario, like for example, virtual delivery of products and services, as well as virtual delivery of classroom lectures. So if I showed you the whole ranking for the 80, approximately 80 sectors, you would see universities would be at the low end of the spectrum because of their ability to transfer their classroom delivery of lectures to virtual format. So I don't know if can you repeat the question again? I don't know if I answered it adequately.
Okay, hold on. Hold on, because I already scroll down. Okay, why is it considered that suppression and mitigation are counterintuitive? I suppose with the results in your summary, you mentioned that they were the results were counterintuitive.
Yeah, counterintuitive, not counterintuitive for sectors like universities and Instacart. Counterintuitive for sectors in which workers have to be physically in their place of work. Because let's say it's been more than a month that people are here in the United States are asked to stay at home. So some of those workers are literally unemployed. So that's the counterintuitive result. Why is it that I think Marka, that's a very good question, and it's also one of the questions that was asked by the reviewer. It says that why is it that economic losses are lower for suppression and mitigation when for the case of the baseline workers are able to freely move around. So the one my counter argument is that if you let people roam around, they would get sick.
Mhm.
The peak infection rate will be higher. They would die, just like what's happening in Sweden right now, unfortunately, which compensates, which balances the difference in economic losses between baseline and suppression and mitigation.
We have one question from Vince Daria. So it was a nice talk. How effective is Monte Carlo modeling in predicting human reaction to the pandemic?
That's an area that can be considered for future publication. So Monte Carlo simulation can be performed. For example, in the ratio that I use for labor dependence, it's a fixed ratio for each of the sectors. So what if it's in the shape of let's say a beta distribution? A beta distribution is a distribution that ranges between 0 to 1. So it's possible for you to model the ratios as a beta distribution and perform Monte Carlo simulation. It's not a straightforward Monte Carlo simulation. It's an MC Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation because there will be convolutions of variables. So the answer to your question, it's an exciting opportunity which could be a subject of a future publication.
Okay, thank you. We have an offline question from Debbie. Is it possible to do these calculations on a global scale? And is it possible to predict or compute when economic collapse will happen or when recession will occur against the implementation of a prolonged suppression?
It can be performed on a global basis. And also, there are the so-called WIOD, World Input Output Database, which is a way with which the sectors across different countries in the world can be connected with each other. But it's a very complicated process because the curves are not happening at the same time, simultaneously. So China, Singapore, New Zealand, South Korea are already on the downhill. New Zealand is the one that I heard yesterday that it's literally zero infection rate. So it's possible, but the disruption rate, the one that I showed to you, will be complicated because of the mismatch of the durations and the horizons of the epidemic curves. And if successful, it's possible to look at the economic loss results to find a threshold level of, let's say, unemployment rate and GDP percentage loss to set as a red flag for determining whether this is already reaching the levels of the depression era.
I hope we don't reach that
I hope
that
so too.
time.
Fingers crossed. Am I doing the fingers crossed correctly? I did this in
No,
class.
that's not fingers crossed. Okay, another one from Matthew. If mitigation is generally the safest strategy for everyone, why hasn't the US government expanded manufacturing of PPEs knowing that it will save lives because it's the highest output requirement rank?
Hi, Matthew. I'm gonna make a sigh right now because I'm trying to get masks, not even N95 masks.
Mm.
And you know the delivery date, what the delivery date is? June.
When? June.
So
Okay, I thought
it's
next
quite
year.
frustrating. So I don't have a ready answer to your question. I think in fairness, the ventilators was a critical issue at the beginning of the wave, but right now it's not anymore an issue. So nowadays we're talking about tests, the testing kits, the availability of them, and also PPE remains to be a constant problem. So I hope companies will be able to supply the highly needed uh, shortage of these PPEs. One of my best friends, shout out to my friend who's working right now as I speak. She really wanted to attend this webinar, but she's working as a nurse in San Diego.
We'll be
And I
posting the
pray
recording.
for what?
We will be posting the
Yeah,
recording of your
yeah.
webinar.
Her shout out to Paula Perillo from San Diego, one of the frontliners. My hat's off to her, but I don't have a hat right now. And of course, all the doctors, nurses, and
Yes, of course.
healthcare staff.
Okay, we have another question from YouTube. It's from Anthony Chu. What will the new normal of consumption pattern be, and how does it impact resource use? For example, one-on-one app-based food order consumption versus one store serving all on-site consumption from your industrial system point of view.
So it would differ from country to country. In the United States, it's been said that the new normal will be sectors that will benefit from this will be those that deliver food right at your door using online apps. And also companies like, as what I said, GrabHub. In the Philippines, I would expect that companies like Lazada will increase its demand.
Mhm.
And the retail stores, it will continue, it will operate eventually, but because of the social distancing measures, we would expect that the demand will not be as high, probably might not even reach the pre-pandemic situation. It will take years for us to reach that until an effective vaccine has become available, has been made available to the public.
Okay, one question from Christina Kayamanda. What is your basis for scenario 4 for the workforce? Labor return to work practicing social distancing. Is this the assumption?
Um, yes and no. Yes, in a sense that that continuity would include the options that I mentioned in one of the slides, which is curbside curbside availability of products.
Mhm.
So I've heard in Texas, which opened today or yesterday, that restaurants will be serving their food at their patio, and there will be 6 feet of at least 6 feet of separation. So that's the yes part. The no part is for sectors that are fully able to transfer their operations into a virtual platform, then we won't expect them to be implementing social distancing measures just like for retail stores and restaurants.
Okay. Another one from Raymond Tan. Can you please comment briefly? How would we use IO to design post lockdown exit strategies?
These questions are really tough. so so um, so the input output data tells us the dependence of each sector with another. So for a post lockdown scenario, one possibility is to decrease the coupling of the sectors. So thereby increasing the independence of the sectors on production inputs, including raw materials coming from other sectors, as well as value-added inputs, including workforce.
Okay. We have a question from Jennifer Sagibo. What will be the effect of this pandemic on choosing careers for young people and its implication in the economy?
Choosing careers like
Yes.
employment. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's hard to predict the future, but I would speculate that there will be rise in the employment opportunities for IT dependent or sectors that highly rely on IT, and like the lowest hanging fruit I could think of will be, of course, it has some stigma like BPO call centers.
Mm-hmm.
There will also be increase in opportunities for IT in general, computer programming, computer science, development of applications, and so on.
Okay, thank you. I think we've exhausted all the questions. Thank you very much, Just. But before we end this session, can I just make a plug for next week's webinar? Okay, hold on. Okay, so I just wanted to invite everyone for our next week's webinar. So again, it will be done on Friday at 8 o'clock in the morning, Philippine Standard Time, or Thursday night for those in the US. So it is on bridging the different classes of epidemic models, insights, and policy implications. Our speaker will be Professor Chris Monterola, who is currently an Aboitiz Chair in Data Science at the Asian Institute of Management. So if you want to hear more, please join us next next Friday. For those of you, again, plugging PAASE, so the activities of our members can be viewed online via our Facebook page. So we have the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering, and we also have a website which can be found at paase.org. So if you want to see the other activities of our members, not just with regards to the pandemic, COVID-19, we have other activities ongoing. So please feel free to visit the website. And for Facebook, you can send us a message for any inquiries. Okay. So I guess that's it for me. Juice, do you have anything to add?
Nothing more. Thank you very much. And I will be remiss not to say it. Huge acknowledgments for Dr. Kathleen Aviso for her spectacular public
Haha.
service to PAASE. I'm not kidding, seriously.
Hold on, Juice, we have a follow-up question. Sorry, from Giselle. What is the impact of this on experimental research?
So, I look up highly to people like Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, if I'm pronouncing her name, and people who are developing the vaccines. So these are the things that we take for
Yes,
granted. So
true.
I really high accolades for people like Gisela who are highly involved in experimental stuff. And all of her emails, I constantly read them like PCR, vaccines, PPEs, and so on. Thank you for keeping us educated on this technical issues that are beyond me.
Yeah, and we actually have PAASE members working on those different aspects of the pandemic. So it's really something that we need to develop the competence on, nationwide basis and globally. And I really hope that people now begin to understand the importance of research of our scientists and our engineers and researchers, both in the lab and those doing models like what you've presented to us today. Okay, so with that, thank you everyone. So this ends our webinar for this week and hope to see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.